The clowns in 2016 almost killed me. Before I begin, I want to lay down some basic facts about my story. I was 13 at the time of this occurrence, and had been reading creepypastas and true stories since I was 11. Bad habits. I live in Carroll Island, a place with a good amount of forestry everywhere. This was located in Baltimore County, and I loved hearing Goatman stories about this place. I believe there is one in Carroll Island, but that's not the point. I loved this bit of forestry and had always when I was a child. I had lived in this house, still am, since I was 7 to 8. These forests, like any other town, always had some urban legend behind them. Some of these were mostly told by older kids who were just trying to scare the kids who would wander about the streets. The teens would always go into the woods to smoke pot, drink alcohol. I hated that, but it's how they got their kicks. Story starts here. I was outside of my house, sometime near January on a full moon, can't recall which month perfectly, just know it was a full moon. This was when some of the clown things were starting to die off and come back in April 2017. I never believed in them, and still don't, but that night I think I did. I walked inside my house with me, my brother, and my friend who we'll call Kyle. Kyle was from the Dominican Republic and had always believed in the paranormal, so we had a good bit in common. We walked into my brother's room since it was the largest, and were watching Logan Paul's controversial Suicide Forest video. Once it was done, Kyle remembered it was a full moon, and that the clowns were out tonight. I called Bull and told him it was all hoaxes and insane people on highways. He doubled me by saying that if I didn't believe, they'd get me. I laughed at his remark to that, and told him to stop believing all that stuff. That's when my brother, who I'll call Josh, sat up and said that I was just scared. I told him he was a jerk, and that it wasn't funny. We got into a conversation for a good 10 minutes when Kyle finally said,
"Then, why don't you go prove it?"
I said okay, and told them that I would be back. I know just the place to prove it. There was a little place down the road that was put there for a park essentially. It wasn't funded, the only thing it had was a small walk bridge that was pretty nice. We called it the Duck Pond, but it actually was Seneca Creek. I'm giving all the location details to give you a better understanding of how scary this place would have been at night. I left the house, got onto my bike, and rode off 2 blocks away. At the entrance of the park is another set of woods that is private property for houses on the water and some abandoned houses inside. The entrance is easy to see, you can't miss it, and personally, it looks pretty. As I was walking up to the entrance, I had noticed a foul odor. Keep in mind that this is wildlife, where things die and decompose right there. It wasn't helped by the stench of trash, reeking from the trash island. I was about to walk into the park when I kid you not, something had spoken in a low, somewhat luring voice.
"Hey there, kiddo, why don't you come over here?"
This is when I went into freaking panic mode. I am someone who isn't scared off so easily, but it was the thought that it could be someone out there. The unknown, that scared me. I turned towards the small patch of bushes near the entrance, and I saw something crouched over deep in the bushes, facing me. I couldn't tell if it was a clown or a demon. I didn't freaking care at this point. Even thinking about it is making me paranoid. As I was gonna man up and go see what it was, it spoke again.
"That's right, come over here."
And I heard a sheathing of a blade. That's when I knew it was time to book it. I instantly wailed out in fright, almost peeing myself, and crashed into that bike. I say if I hadn't been riding for many years and built up muscle to power out of there, I would have been done. I floored it back to my house. At this point, my body is in complete hysteria, and Kyle said that once I opened the door, I was not comprehensible. It took me a minute to calm down and realize I shouldn't be so scared. I explained to Kyle and Josh what had just happened, and we agreed to go back tomorrow and freak up whoever was there. We never did, and I never go there at night. Creepy man in the freaking bushes, whoever you are, if you're still out there. Let's not meet again. Burglary horror story. I live in a fairly secure area and have 2 dogs. One is a large Doberman, and the other is a poodle. I was home alone as my parents were out for the weekend, Our dogs bark a lot as they are very protective, and the neighbors hated when the dogs barked. They would often leave notes telling us to keep the dogs quiet. One of the more threatening ones stated that he would hurt the dog if it wouldn't be quiet. So, my parents had them taken to a dog kennel to avoid any complications. I was home alone, playing video games and watching movies for the weekend. It was the night after they had left, and I was playing a video game. I think it was Rainbow Six Siege. I was playing with a few friends, and I had my microphone on. I was playing with my window open, and my friends kept telling me to stop making a squeaky sound. I questioned what he meant, and my friends said that it was a loud banging. I removed my headphones, and that was when I heard it, the sound of something slamming into the gate. I peered out, and there was a tall, stocky man with a black hood on, looking down and slamming his body into the fence. Since the fence was weak, the wood was splitting. I decided to call the police rather than my parents, but decided to stay near the window, still watching the man. I was talking to the 911 operator. The operator told me to lock myself in a room, get out of sight, and that a police officer was on the way. However, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to continue watching the man. He finally broke the wooden gate off its hinges, but he didn't enter. He strapped something around his shoulder, and upon further inspection, only in the moonlight, I saw a hunting rifle strapped to his back. That's when I went and hid underneath the bed, listening out for anything until a loud shatter broke the silence, which was the back door smashing, followed by footsteps entering the house. The intruder sounded like he was searching for something. He was creeping up the stairs until the sound of police sirens flooded my ears. I made the stupid decision of bolting to try to escape the house. I started to get to the stairs, turned the corner, and was greeted by a large man following the description of the man trying to break in. The man gripped his neck, and the police sirens got louder. The police were knocking on his door. He was quickly losing breath from the man strangling him. The cloth covering his face slipped down to reveal my neighbor. I was nearly out of breath. He let me go and gripped his rifle, aimed it at me, and pulled the trigger, but it didn't fire. The dumbass left the safety on. The police kicked the door down and tossed the man. The man was found and was charged with breaking and entering and carrying an unlicensed firearm. I'm thankful that the safety was on, as this could have ended very badly. Later, I went to my Xbox and told my friends what happened, that I almost died, and they were very concerned. A visit from Slender Man. I live with my parents and my younger sister, who was 17 at the time, in a nice residential condo up in the hills. One day, after work, while I was arriving at my house, there was a strong windstorm going on. It was so strong that some trees fell down, and the streets were full of leaves and pine needles. When I arrived home, there were so many pine needles piled up in front of my house that I had to be careful not to trip. On the other side of the street, there is an empty lot with nothing built on it, and a wall that divides my residential area from another one next to it. While I was looking at all the pine needles piled up, I realized that although I had neighbors on both sides of my house, the leaves and needles were only piled up in front of my house. I knew that no one had cleaned up their part of the street because it was still windy when I was arriving home. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the wind stopped, and the air seemed still for a bit. It was starting to get dark, but the lighting around my house seemed strange. That's when I felt as if someone was watching me. I started to feel sick and dizzy and began to see fireworks in my vision, the kind you see when you're about to pass out. I've overcome some hardships in my life and consider myself relatively strong-willed, so I held myself against my car and stumbled to my house's door, almost passing out. As I've had high blood pressure since I was 16, I didn't think much about it. After several minutes staring at my door from the inside, I got up, locked the door, and went on with the night. Hours later, I was playing League of Legends with my sister, as I'm addicted to it, when I noticed some movement in the empty terrain in front of my house. It only had a few trees, but in the dark, you can't see very far. That's when, with a gasp, I saw him, a tall white figure with no eyes or facial features. He was wearing some form of a black blazer, and there were shadows creeping from behind him. I turned to look at my sister, called her, but when I looked back to the terrain, it was empty. I shrugged it off and asked her if she would care to sleep in my room that day, and she said okay. 1 week went by, giving me a feeling of dread every time I was around my house but outside of it. When I arrived home on one of these days, it was strangely still clear, while on other days at the same time, it was usually dark. While getting my things out of my car, I turned to look at the empty terrain when I noticed a woman screaming,
"Go away,"
and closing her windows fiercely. Her house was in the other residential condo on the other side of the wall next to the empty lot. I was startled for a moment, and went straight to my house. I've never said anything about it to anyone, but the next day, my sister came to me worried, saying that she had a nightmare where I was going crazy because I could see Slender Man. That gave me chills down my spine, and I felt dizzy again. I started explaining the recent events to her, and she laughed, saying that there is no such thing as Slender Man and that I must be forgetting to take my blood pressure medicine, which I sometimes forget to take, but I knew that wasn't the case. The next week, I had forgotten about all of that. While arriving home, I opened the door to my house, and a huge rodent entered my house running. It was probably 60 centimeters from head to tail, and went into the kitchen. This rodent lives in the woods near my home, and due to environmental laws, we can't kill it or relocate it. I was chasing it out of my house when he jumped onto a metal table we have and started gnarling at me. I screamed at him, which made him pissed off, and I swear he was about to jump at me when he suddenly stopped, looked behind me, and started to urinate. I felt something strange behind me, so I turned to look, only to find nothing between me and the door behind me. The rat jumped off the table, fell awkwardly to the floor, and fled through a door that leads outside behind my home. My sister was startled by the whole ordeal and asked me what the hell happened. When I explained, I told her that I'd seen that rodent before, and it had never gotten so close to me before. He was always afraid of me. I asked my sister what she thought about it, and she said, maybe there was something more frightening than you outside. That night, I had trouble sleeping, and when I did fall asleep, I dreamed about him, a tall figure lurking in the forest near my home. In my dream, my home shone light onto him, making him flee the woods. Since that dream, I've never felt his presence again. But sometimes, I wonder what made him go away and why he came to my house. There was something knocking at my door. This happened about 2 years ago, nearing the end of September. My aunt and her friend decided to fly up to New York from Panama to enjoy their mini vacation with my parents and me. Although many strange and paranormal experiences have happened to me ever since I was little, this event stayed with me and affected me more than the other experiences. Here's the thing, many things have happened to a lot of my family members, especially my aunt and her friend. We'll get back to that later though. So, it was around 10:30 at night. Keep in mind that my old neighborhood was a very calm and quiet place. Since I live near the countryside, not much action happens in the neighborhoods. The neighbors were either elderly or young couples with smaller children, none that could cause trouble around the neighborhood. There were only about 20 to 25 houses in the entire neighborhood I lived in. Moving on, the three of us decided to stay up late to watch scary movies while my parents slept upstairs in their room. My aunt's friend was sitting near the sliding doors leading to the backyard, while my aunt and I were sitting on the bigger couch near the front door. I was sitting on the left side where the door faced, and my aunt sat on the right side of me, which meant I was closest to the front door. We spent about 10 minutes debating on which movie we should watch. After those 10 minutes, we finally chose to watch Odd Thomas, which wasn't really a scary movie, but it was about a guy who could see spirits and demons. What a coincidence. We were only 2 minutes into the movie when I had a sudden urge to look at the door. I glanced back at my aunt and her friend, only to see them staring at the door as well. I looked back at the door for about 5 seconds, and then a loud bang came, followed by another one, and then a third one. All 3 bangs came from the front door, almost as if 5 people had just body slammed into the door 3 times. I thought it was going to fly off of its frame. My first instinct was to run to the kitchen and grab a knife, but as I was about to do that, my aunt grabbed me by my shirt and told me to stay down. As I looked to my right, I saw my aunt's friend with her knees to her chest, rocking herself back and forth, while my aunt just kept her gaze towards the door. While all three of us kept our attention on the door, next to it, there were two small rectangular windows on either side of the door. The right window had a small curtain, and the left side was being covered with a small decorative tree. The small curtain had a gap in between because it was glued onto the window from the top area to the bottom area, leaving the middle part loose. At the moment of the bangs, it caused the middle area of the curtain to puff up slowly and then quickly press against the window, leaving it wrinkled. After that, we were all silent. All of us were terrified. My aunt denied being scared, but at that moment, I could see nothing but fear on her face. I wanted to run upstairs to get my parents, but I was too afraid to go up the stairs because it was right in front of the door. All I could do was text and call them, but they were too deep in their slumber to hear their phones ring. My aunt told the two of us to calm down and dismissed it as the wind. We all knew it couldn't have been, but to stay calm, she made up that excuse. And I must say that it was totally cliché. The next morning, I told my mother about the previous events. She brushed it off by saying it must have been a bear or a deer. Another cliché thing to say. We both went outside to inspect and found my mom's decorations near the front door thrown off to the side. There were no scratch marks or bumps on the door. Everything seemed normal, except for her decorations lying on the side. When the three of us looked at the door the night of the event, there wasn't anything that could have caught our attention. Since the woods were 40 meters away from my house, we would have heard the trees moving with the wind, but we heard nothing. The movie was playing at that time, but it was strange how we all felt a sudden urge to look at the door, almost as if we knew that something was about to happen. The bangs were extremely loud and caused me to jump up from the couch. It couldn't have been kids playing a prank on us because I'd been living there for about 3 years, and nothing like that had ever happened. Plus, I knew the neighbors well enough to know that they'd never do such a thing. There were exactly 3 bangs, one after the other, and one could have honestly caused the door to fly out of place, but thank God it didn't. What about the curtain? The only explanation we could come up with was that the impact of the bangs created the wind, causing the curtain to react that way. But why did it inflate slowly if the bangs were rapid and then suddenly cause it to go against the window so fast after the bangs were over? My aunt thinks that the wind must have been knocked off of its course. That's why we didn't hear the trees moving and created huge columns of wind that must have caused the door to move so much. The gust of wind must have gotten inside the house from the cracks of the door, leading the curtain to puff up. Personally, it doesn't make sense and sounds like total BS to me. She also mentioned she saw a shadow outside, but she doesn't have an explanation for that. I didn't see a shadow outside though. My mother came up with an excuse as well. She said it might have been a deer or a bear. But why would a deer or a bear bang their head or entire body for that matter into a door? Like I previously said, there were no scratch marks to prove it was an animal. No animal could have caused those 3 loud bangs. We've had deer sightings in that neighborhood before, but none that have acted in such strange behavior. Usually, they would all run back into the woods. Bears are out of the question. Not once have there been sightings of them. I should also mention that we had the lights from outside on. Why would an animal come that close to a house, especially a door that is clearly being illuminated by a light? Like I said before, animals in general are out of the question. As I mentioned before, my aunt, along with my mother, has had experienced many unexplained events and they believe in the paranormal. I think the only reason they tried to make up an excuse for this situation was to prevent me from becoming paranoid and afraid. It's pretty late for that now since I've had my fair share of experiences as well. Now, to my aunt's friend, my aunt told me that when her friend was younger, she suffered from really bad night terrors. She said she saw things, demonic entities, as she described them. She'd wake up screaming and crying. It was traumatizing for her. Her family had always been religious, and they prayed for her every night, and slowly, those things haunting her went away as she grew up. That really creeped me out and led me to believe that she might have brought or attracted that thing to my house. Or maybe it could have been something else. I hope this never happens to me again. Please let me know if you guys think it might have been the wind that could have caused those 3 extremely loud knocks at my door, or an animal, or some kind of creature. Killer Duplex Neighbor. This incident is tough for me to talk about. I am a 27-year-old male and have been living in New Hampshire for about 2 years, in an extremely safe town. I lived alone with my dog Toby during this time and worked from 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. Sharing a duplex was new to me and quite different, especially when your neighbors were very odd. There was a lady in her 60s and a younger man in his 30s. I believe they were mother and son because they wouldn't speak to me, but I had no clue. I tried making small talk, but neither of them said a word. The mother looked beat down with gray hair, and she wore the same blue nightgown every time I saw her. I would see the son smoking outside wearing the same white undershirt since I moved in 7 months prior. It was a summer night in July, around 11 p.m. when I let Toby out in the backyard. Now, mind you, I shared a backyard with these creeps. Toby was running around, and I heard the neighbor's sliding door open. I saw the younger man in his undershirt walk out onto his deck and give me a death glare. My heart dropped, and I began feeling extreme anxiety. I saw him reach into his pocket and pull out a gun. He pointed it at Toby and fired 4 times. I screamed louder than I ever have in my life. The man ran inside and closed his door. I began sprinting towards Toby, but he fled into the woods. I immediately called 911 and told them what happened. The police arrived in 5 minutes and surrounded our duplex. They placed me in the police car and asked me to recount what happened. My dog Toby never barked and was the most well-behaved puppy, so he had no excuse to shoot him. The cops were outside for about 15 minutes until they heard 3 gunshots. They rushed inside and found the mother and son deceased, both with bullet wounds. Come to find out later, the son had shot his mother twice and committed suicide with a single shot to the head. Later that night, Toby came back and was shot in his back leg. After a couple of surgeries, he came back brand new. This was the most horrific thing I have ever witnessed, and I am blessed. In the days that followed, the fire was featured on the front page of the local paper. The family that lived just down the hall from us were featured in the picture. The article spelled out details that I had already heard. It labeled the guy that lived below the fire as a hero for attempting to save the lady upstairs. It was a valiant effort, but there was nothing he could have done without endangering himself. I feel sorry for him, and I often wonder if the guilt keeps him up at night. Sometimes I think about the lady who passed away in this building. I listen to a lot of ghost stories, so I wonder if her spirit haunts this place. Her sudden and horrifying death would be the sort of thing to make a ghost linger on Earth, wouldn't it? So many things left unfinished. Regardless, I hope she's at peace, and I hope that my neighbors have been able to find some semblance of peace as well. For months later we've regained a sense of normalcy. Things are back to how they were before, if you ignore the orange tarps around the side of the exterior, the restoration vans that come and go every day, and the security guards stationed in the lobby. The damaged wing is still closed while they try to sort out the asbestos situation, but for those of us who live on the other end of the building, things are relatively normal. I hope they stay that way. 4 a.m. fire. I live in an old apartment building. I've been here for about 2 years, and my roommate and I have had very few scary experiences so far, except for this one that happened last summer. It was around 4 in the morning when we were woken from a deep sleep by the fire alarms going off throughout our entire 4-story apartment building. Since this place is mostly occupied by seniors, we figured someone had left a pot on the stove again. I grumbled and blindly grabbed for a blanket. Last time we had a false alarm, I was left shivering and barefoot on the sidewalk waiting for the fire department, and I wasn't about to let that happen again. My roommate and I put on our shoes, I grabbed my phone and keys, and we poked our heads out into the hallway. Nothing seemed off. The hall was empty. No one else had come out of their apartments yet. Reluctantly, my roommate and I walked down the hall toward the lobby. We figured our neighbors would soon follow suit. It was only when we went through the lobby and out the front door that we realized something was actually wrong. A handful of people who had already come out of the building were running and shouting about how the building was actually on fire this time. We followed them around to the side of the building as more and more people fled in their pajamas, and to our horror, we saw an apartment on the top floor belching out flames. People were frantic, searching for water, a ladder, anything. Someone remarked that there was a lady who lived in that apartment who had mobility issues and she needed to be rescued now. And where the hell was the fire department? My roommate was quite disturbed by the whole scene, so we decided to go back to the front of the building, away from the fire. On our way, we saw a guy jump off his balcony to the ground. He rolled when he landed, but I think it still really hurt, judging from how he sat on the grass and groaned for a while. He was lucky to only be on the second floor. There was chaos, yelling, screaming, an odd mix of panic and disinterest, especially among the senior citizens who didn't want to leave the building because using the stairs was so difficult. The fire department arrived much quicker than they ever had before, seeing as this was a real emergency. And it wasn't long before elderly ladies in nightgowns were being rescued via ladders and wheeled off to the hospital next door. At one point, the man who lived below the apartment on fire had a screaming episode at one of the landlords, the one that looked like a walking skeleton with an oxygen tank and a scooter. By the time the fire department got everything under control, it was around 6 or 7 a.m. The sun was up, and people were beginning their morning commute. The fire department had blocked off our whole street, which must have been a pain, and the entire population of my building sat on the curb in pajamas and blankets. Little kids, old people, broke college kids, you name it. The community really pulled together that morning. The public bus service gave us a couple of buses to sit and warm up in instead of standing around on the chilly sidewalk. Paramedics handed out blankets and assessed injuries. The people in the surrounding houses were kind enough to bring us water and snacks. One lady brought a serving tray with mugs of tea from her own kitchen and offered it to anyone she could find. My mom came down to rescue my roommate and me, even though she lived an hour outside of town and hadn't even showered yet. She brought us breakfast and a change of clothes, as we didn't know when we'd be allowed back into the building. The most disturbing details of what had just taken place that morning came to us as we were waiting on the bus. Everyone was talking about the fire, of course, but one man had a particularly horrifying detail to add. He'd heard through the grapevine that the lady whose apartment caught fire never made it out of the building. Sadly, we suspected as much, with her mobility issues and all. But there was more. The firefighters apparently found her in the hall. She had made it out of her apartment but couldn't escape the smoke. Whether she died from smoke inhalation or from burns, we aren't sure. But one thing that man said that sticks with me is that someone said that as they stood outside and watched the flames, they heard the woman screaming,
"Help me, I'm burning."
I've always been afraid of burning to death, and the idea that my neighbor may have had such a horrifying end is deeply disturbing. I know the man who lived below her heard her screaming. He wouldn't stop talking about it. I think he ended up with a form of PTSD from this event, and I don't blame him. We were all brought to a community center where the fire department and emergency response volunteers helped bring some clarity to the situation and told us what to expect. Everyone was very kind and sympathetic to us, providing whatever we needed. I think all of that is pretty standard procedure, but still, I was extremely thankful for the kindness of the volunteers, firefighters, paramedics, and Good Samaritans. It was pretty surreal to be in a situation like that. We had almost nothing on us. My roommate hadn't thought to grab her phone, so she had to borrow mine to let her family know she was okay. We had no money, no ID, none of the essentials, and we had no idea how long we would be homeless. I hadn't been so happy to have my mom with me in a long time. I felt like a scared little girl, even if I didn't show it. We were lucky. The fire happened on the opposite end of the building from us. Our unit was totally unaffected, and we were one of the few allowed back into our apartment that same day. The building stunk of smoke for weeks. Even though the fire took place on the 4th floor in a single apartment, the damage was extensive. Even on the ground floor, the walls were blackened with ash. When they attempted to start fixing up the building, they found asbestos in the walls. A few people were forced to move out of their apartments, and we're talking about people who had lived there for around 30 years. I remember the night we were allowed back into our apartment. I wanted to box up my most important possessions and keep them in my car, as if I thought the building was going to catch fire again. My home didn't feel safe anymore, and it wouldn't for several weeks. It would take a long time for us to hear anything about what caused the fire. The last I heard, a space heater was to blame, but I don't know for sure. In the days that followed, the fire was featured on the front page of the local paper. The family that lived just down the hall from us was featured in the picture. The article spelled out details that I had already heard. It labeled the guy who lived below the fire as a hero for attempting to save the lady upstairs. It was a valiant effort, but there was nothing he could have done without endangering himself. I feel sorry for him, and I often wonder if the guilt keeps him up at night. Sometimes, I think about the lady who passed away in this building. I listen to a lot of ghost stories, so I wonder if her spirit haunts this place. Her sudden and horrifying death would be the kind of thing that might make a ghost linger on Earth, wouldn't it? So many things left unfinished. Regardless, I hope she's at peace, and I hope that my neighbors have been able to find some semblance of peace as well. For months later, we've regained a sense of normalcy. Things are back to how they were before, if you ignore the orange tarps around the side of the exterior, the restoration vans that come and go every day, and the security guards stationed in the lobby. The damaged wing is still closed while they try to sort out the asbestos situation. But for those of us who live on the other end of the building, things are relatively normal. I hope they stay that way. When I was younger, I used to visit my grandparents all the time. They lived in a one-floor house with an unfinished basement. I never liked it down there. It felt too small for such a big basement. There was a little door down there meant for storage, and I always got a horrible feeling when I got close to it. Let me add that this was a newer house, about 6 years old. Now, during the time when I was about 6 or 7, I felt very uncomfortable going down there, even when I was with someone. I didn't like it. I remember going down there with my grandma to help with something. She had to run upstairs because someone rang the doorbell. She said she would be right back, even though she knew how I felt about being alone down there. I nodded and said,
Oh, okay.
She was gone, and I was alone. I started to get a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I didn't move and didn't want to, even though the lights were on. Now, this is where everything started happening, and it still gives me chills. The lights started to flicker, and I began to hear noises and what sounded like talking. It wasn't coming from upstairs but from the storage room. I heard someone say my name. Here is the part that freaks me out the most. The voice sounded like my grandma. I was confused as hell. How was I hearing her when she was upstairs? I didn't want to move, but being the curious one that I am, I started moving toward the storage room door. The closer I got, the worse the bad feeling became. When I got to the door, the lights turned off in the basement. I wanted to run upstairs and hide, go home, anywhere but the basement. I heard my name again for the second time, my grandma's voice asking me to open the door to help her. So I did, and I regret it. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. I couldn't hear anything but faint laughter. It felt like forever, but then the laughing stopped, and the lights turned back on in the basement, making me feel a little bit better with the lights back on. But the downside was that I could see a little bit in the storage room. I saw a small clown doll in the storage room, and my grandma hates clowns with a passion and wants nothing to do with them. So why was there a clown doll? I have no damn idea. Then the lights turned on in the storage room, and I saw red that looked like blood all over the place. I screamed and blacked out. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the couch, my grandma looking at me and asking if I was okay. I have no idea if that was real or a dream, but it sure as hell felt real. The room with the train. This story is not about a ghost, an encounter with a creepy stranger, or even a near-death experience. As a matter of fact, I was never in danger during the event I'm about to tell you about. Nonetheless, it's a disturbing memory that I will carry with me until the day I die. I grew up in a small city. the kind of place you could barely call a town if it weren't for the sheer number of people living there. Downtown was only a couple of blocks long, and in the middle of it was one of the biggest buildings in the area. It was the local movie theater, named after the city. I remember going there when I was very young, about 7 years old, and watching the first Pokemon movie. It was probably nothing compared to the theaters we have nowadays, but back then, it was huge for me. I loved it. So when, a few years later, I heard the cinema was going out of business, I felt really sad about it. The building was sold to a religious group that used it for their services. You know the type. Loud music, big crowds with their arms in the air singing prayers, some having seizures on stage while the pastor yells through a mic. Every time I walked past the old cinema, I would see the announcements of the congregation where the movie posters would have been, and if they were in session, you could hear them singing from the other side of the street. This group owned the cinema for nearly a decade, until the local government bought back the building to restore it as a historic landmark of the city. When this happened, I was studying construction, with the intent to follow architecture or civil engineering at college, and my class was very lucky to be involved in the cinema's restoration project because 2 of our teachers were architects working on it. I will always remember the day we went to visit the old cinema. Our class was small, only a handful of students, but we were all around the same age, so we all shared childhood memories of when the cinema was operational. We ran through the corridors of the auditorium, sat in the chairs just like we did when we were little kids, and began stomping on the wooden floor with our feet, filling the entire room with the echoes of our drumming and our laughter, a little ritual of sorts everyone used to do right before the beginning of the movie. Once nostalgia time was over, we went back to the purpose of the trip and began to survey the building. We were very excited because that was a unique opportunity to go into places we would have never been allowed to otherwise. So we made sure to check every last corner, every single room, no matter how far, no matter how obscure. The first one we found was below the stage. In one of the corners, there was a little door, not very visible, probably meant for maintenance staff only. Behind it, we found a long room filled with rusty boilers, part of the old heating system that was no longer in use. The place was a little creepy, with all those old tanks and pipes crowding the narrow space, but what we found past them was what really started to freak us out. This room was small, very small. It was, after all, basically just leftover space behind the boilers. Yet it contrasted so much with the rest of the area around it. It may as well have been from a different place altogether. The walls were painted a light color, white I think, but I don't remember it very well because what really got my attention were the drawings on them. There were rainbows, a smiling sun, trees, and flowers, and happy little people with smiles on their faces of dotted eyes. It was a daycare. The whole class and teacher gathered to see the discovery. We were all very confused about the strange placing of this room. Okay, we could understand the need for a place to keep the kids that were too little to be amongst the crowd during prayers, or maybe the ones of the people who worked there, but the placing was just odd. The stage was probably one of the loudest places in the auditorium during the services, and this was right below it, so there was no way it could be a quiet place for the children. We left the boilers room and continued our tour through the theater, a little puzzled about our finding but not giving it too much thought. Outside of the auditorium, there were the bathrooms, both in terrible condition, the ticket sales booth, and a huge set of stairs that led to a mezzanine in the auditorium. Half of the seats there were totally ruined due to a water leak in the roof, and I cursed these people for not taking proper care of the building. With that part done, all that was left was the projection room, on the 3rd floor. Behind the ticket booth, there was a door that led to a spiral stair. I don't remember how tall it actually was, but it must have been over 10 meters of metallic steps without a single resting spot. I wasn't exactly an athlete, but I could walk several kilometers with no problem and rode on a bike to and from school every single day. Yet by the time I reached the top of the stairs, I was exhausted. And I wasn't the only one. All of my classmates complained about how hard it was to walk up there. After a short break to catch our breath, we moved on to explore the 3rd floor. It was roughly a narrow passageway with a couple of divisions to form different rooms, but it was more than enough for what it was made for. The first room from the stairs was a storage deposit, probably where they kept the movies and other equipment, and except for some trash, it was mostly empty. The second room was the one we were all excited to see, the projector room. The old machine was so big that it was still there, and there were even some pieces scattered around. It was quite a piece of history, and we were all very thrilled to check it out, so no one really bothered to move on to the very last room until we were about to leave. And there we saw it again. There was a train in this one instead of a rainbow. Something was written on it, in big, colorful letters, something about Christ. I can't remember it well. The drawings were a bit old, the paint slightly peeled from the walls, but the colors were just as cheerful as you would expect for a place where children play. My heart sank to my stomach as I came to the realization of what that place really was, the one behind the boilers probably serving the same purpose. I took notice of how isolated that room was, literally the furthest away you could possibly get from everyone else. I thought about the 3 floors of stairs and imagined what it would have been like for a child to walk all the way up, only to end up in that room, the room with the colorful train on the wall. My classmates and I exchanged horrified expressions, as I knew they were thinking the same. We never visited the theater again, even though we continued with the restoration project for several months, and we never talked about those 2 rooms. Cases of molestation in the church are well known by everyone, to the point that the pedopriest is practically a cliché. But this is the kind of thing you think happens in some place far away, in another city, even in another country. You never imagine it can happen in the very same town you live, the place where you grew up, and the very same building where you once watched a Pokemon movie when you were 7 years old. The woman in the white dress. This happened just yesterday, so it's fresh in my mind. I'm not quite sure what to think of it because it was just so bizarre and unbelievable. I might have just been sleep deprived. So last night at maybe 2300 hours, I was walking around my block. My town is relatively safe, so I didn't feel in danger, plus it was a pretty night. I had been walking for around 5 minutes when a pale woman with blonde hair and a white dress caught my eye from across the street. She was about my height and looked to be around my age too. I didn't actually pay attention to her after I first noticed her. While I circled the block again, she was on the same street, a couple of feet in front of me. She was standing on the curb, staring at the cars passing by. It was a main road, so even that late people were still driving on it. I said hello to her, and she turned her gaze to me. I couldn't see her face super well, but from what I think I saw, she had no pupils or color in her eyes. She just stared at me. After a while, I asked if she was okay. She didn't respond again and simply pointed at the road. I was really confused and didn't understand. Right as a red car started coming down the road, she stepped into the road. The car slammed into her, and it was a bloody mess. The driver immediately stopped and jumped out. It was a man in his mid-20s. We both spoke about it, freaking out. He called the police, and I went around the car to see the state of the girl. Once I circled around the car, she was gone. Not gone as in dead, gone as in she just wasn't there. The blood on the road was gone too, but not gone from his car. After the police arrived, they concluded that it was some big hoax of a kid who didn't know what they were talking about, and some guy who went along with it. The blood on the truck was brought to investigation only to be found as paint. Nothing else was put up about it. I'm still not sure if what happened was real. It felt so real, but I don't believe in the paranormal. I don't know what it was. If it was just a dream or if it was real. I remember it like it was real. I feel like I can't leave the house now. I don't understand anything now, and I kind of feel like I'm going crazy. Has anyone else experienced something like this? The Grinning Man. My name is Matthew Calamane, and I am the writer and director of the feature film titled The Grin, a story based on true events that actually happened on the set where it was filmed, otherwise known as my childhood home. I found myself at home one weekend night. My parents were out of town, and I was returning from a cancelled sleepover at a friend's house. The lights were on when I got in the door, and I remember getting a phone call from that same friend shortly thereafter, which would end up being the last normal event of the night. My brother was playing video games in the next room, and I could hear him tapping furiously at a video game while I spoke on the cordless phone. I walked around in the living room and ended the phone call in the kitchen when I heard some kind of high-pitched squeal coming from somewhere in the house. I couldn't place where it was coming from as it sounded the same in every room I went to investigate. It ended about a minute after it started and was interrupted by the phone ringing. However, the phone was not in the kitchen where I left it. It was in the bathroom on the counter in front of the sink. I answered the phone, and there was nobody there, so I hung up. It was at that point when I heard a dragging sound, like a large heavy object was being dragged in the attic crawl space above me. I followed the sound as it slowly moved from room to room and ended up in my parents' bedroom, who still had a waterbed. After the sound reached the far wall, it stopped, and the phone rang again, this time with my friend on the other end. I told him what was going on, and he told me to be careful and call the police. After I got off the phone, I laid down on the waterbed and was horrified to find a body-shaped solid object inside the waterbed mattress. I leaped out of it. I then heard a knock at the door and answered it quickly, but there was nobody there. At this point, my brother called me from his room to check something out that he had just discovered in the game he was playing. A little more than annoyed at his lack of interest in what was going on, I stormed into his room. There was nobody there. His bed was made, and the room was spotless. Neither the console nor the TV was on, and the controller was wrapped and unplugged. There was no way he could have hidden and cleaned his room in the few seconds it took me to make it from the front door to his room. I had been alone the entire night, hearing for 20 straight minutes my brother playing a game that he was not present to be playing. The phone rang again, but once again, it was not where I left it. This time it was resting on the kitchen counter where I had originally left it, so I walked through the entire house to answer it. It was my friend calling again, this time saying that the call was dropped for some reason, and he was calling me back. I explained what had just happened, and there was another knock at the door. Since I was standing right next to it, I peeked out of the window within 2 seconds of the knocks, and there was nobody there. At this point, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch to make sure I didn't see anyone running away. I had a large, wide-open yard with nothing to hide behind. I walked into the yard to look around but didn't find anything. I found myself engaged in several more minutes of talking before my friend got off the line, and it was at that moment that I realized the place I had been staring off into space while talking had 2 very large black reflective eyes looking back at me. The figure was tall and lanky, standing only 10 feet or so from me, in the shadow cast by the front garage from the front door light. The most notable feature he wore was an inhumanly large smile, and he was grinning with oily metallic teeth from ear to ear. Despite me staring directly at him for more than 5 minutes, I pretended I did not notice him and through willpower alone, made it inside the house without running as fast as I could. I walked calmly. I remember feeling like if I ran, he would chase me, and somehow I knew that he would have caught me easily. I barricaded myself in my room the rest of the night, and did not fall asleep until the sun came up the next morning when my parents were home. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before, and nothing like that has happened since.